The reading is from Luke chapter 1, verses 57 to 80, and it's on page 1035 of the Church Bibles. The birth of John the Baptist. When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbours and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he is to be called John." They said to her, "There is no one among your relatives who has that name." Then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. He asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment he wrote, "His name is John." Immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. All the neighbours were filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about all these things. Everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, "What then is this child going to be?" For the Lord's hand was with him. His father, Zechariah, was filled with the Holy Spirit and prophesied, "Praise to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he said through his holy prophets of long ago, salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show mercy to our ancestors and to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hand of our enemies and to enable us to serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him all our days. And you, my child, will be called a prophet of the Most High, for you will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace. And the child grew and became strong in spirit, and he lived in the wilderness until he appeared publicly to Israel. This is the gospel of Christ.
Thank you, Liz. The end of that reading, I do morning prayers most days. Hands up, I don't do it every day, but most days I do morning prayers. And the Benedictus, which we're talking about today, is always in my morning prayers set by the Church of England. So they're very familiar words. But the trouble I find with Scripture sometimes, if you know it quite well, it's a little bit like Lord's Prayer. It has a tendency to become a little bit verbatim. In other words, we just say it, but we don't always think about what we're saying. And for me, the Benedictus, even though I've probably said them thousands of times, it wasn't until I sat down and really started looking at this passage that, wow, it just opened it all up for me in a different light. So sometimes it's good to sort of go back to things and just sort of stand back and just reread it, but really think about what I suppose it's called studying Bible, that's what we're doing it. But yeah, it's been really, I must admit this is the third sermon I've done. I wasn't happy, but it's really opened it up for me, the Benedictus. So last week I asked you what your favourite Christmas song was, and we got some fabulous answers, didn't we? We got Fairy Tale in New York. I told you that mine was In the Bleak Midwinter. Out the Old Angels Sing. What else did we get? Anybody remember what we got? We must have had Craig Slade's It's a Merry Christmas, Everybody. So some wonderful answers. And as we draw closer to Christmas, we start towards these wonderful carols. We're going to be singing some tonight. We're going to sing them here next week. And I find that this season never seems long enough to actually really appreciate some of the Christmas carols. Not all of them, must be out. I do struggle with some of them. And have you noticed that there's a bit of a theme going on with this pentad of praise that we've been doing regarding song? First week, Steve mentioned Paul McCartney's Let It Be. Funnily enough, I preached a similar thing up at Trinity. Last week, of course, we had Mary's song, the Magnificat. And today, we come to another song, Zachariah's song. It's as though life's turning into one big musical. Hallelujah. In last week's reading, we learned that Gabriel appeared to Mary with a message that she would bear a son whom she would call Jesus. And in her excitement, Mary went to visit her relative Elizabeth to tell her this good news of her pregnancy with this child she's going to call Jesus. And Mary's response, the only appropriate response, was to sing praises to God. Mary sang, "The Mighty One has done great things for me." Although Zachariah's song of thanks and praise occurs after Mary's song, Luke's account actually begins with them. Mary sings this song of praise and worship to God after she's informed of this miraculous conception and a visit with Elizabeth and Zachariah. Zachariah's song, which is a prophecy, is spoken, and it's after John is born. And Zachariah, as we heard in reading, Zachariah's tongue was untied because Zachariah's punishment of being unable to speak for disbelieving the promises of God that he and Elizabeth would bear a son was removed. So just to bring us all up to speed, if you're not familiar with this story, Zachariah and Elizabeth are an older couple. I choose my words carefully there. An older couple who have never been able to have any children and have actually passed the point where this is actually going to be likely. And in that culture at that time, for a wife not to bear children would have not only been something the couple would have mourned, but something for which they would have probably experienced shame. It's something a husband could even choose to divorce his wife over. If you're looking for something, guys. And on top of that, children were believed to be a sign of God's blessing. Children are, do you know, I love the children being here. I do find them such a blessing when they're in worship. It's a shame they go out, but I suppose they can only take so much, can't we all? They are a blessing. And not having any children must have been considered a sign of God's disapproval. So couples who didn't have any children were sometimes looked on as being judged by God, perhaps for something they'd done wrong. Probably for 20 years or more, Zachariah and Elizabeth would have been walking the road of childlessness and experienced the full spectrum of emotions that must bring along. And they probably experienced them emotions over and over again. Watching their peers become pregnant and raise families, just that aching for that child of their own, mourning that loss, maybe at times blaming one another, all the while experiencing deep shame, judgment from the neighbours, wondering what they'd done, and that God would withhold this from them. I wonder if Zachariah, being a priest, felt an extra measure of shame, always wondering whether he was respected as a leader in the temple because of this so-called sign on God's judgment on them. Do you think Zachariah might have become angry with God? It's good to get angry with God at times. Might he have begun to gradually close the door of his heart to trusting God or to any expectation for God's action as the years continued to pass by? It must have been so difficult, and that's the same for anybody today in that situation. I can't even start to imagine and understand how that must feel. Now, just a slight change of direction, but for a moment, I want you to imagine, this is a total different contrast to this, I want you to imagine life without a television or a radio. Because we're so used to television and radio telling us what to think about all the time. And without it, some people become quite worried, lost in a world of their own unfamiliar thoughts, like an explorer whose guide has just disappeared. You know, some would really be lost without TV. I've got a friend, actually, 3 times a week she puts on Facebook. She tells you what she's having for a tea. It's never that exciting. And she's just going to sit down and watch EastEnders. It's highlight of a week. And I'm sorry, it's a little bit sad, but it is each to their own. I shouldn't take that away. And it's not for me to judge. Who am I to judge? But yeah, what she's having for tea and sitting down to EastEnders, I think there's got to be more to life. Each to their own. But let's be totally honest, how many times have you started a conversation with this? Did you watch last night? And then you got to fill in the blank yourself. We've all done that. Now take away radio, newspaper, media, your smartphone, and what would you think about all day? Because that was the situation, of course, of most people in the world until very recently. In fact, in some parts of the world, it's still that. There is no media, there is no phones, no television. So what's that focus? And it was this situation for everybody in Jesus' time. If you were Zechariah, what would you think about all day? Your family, certainly. Local village businesses, presumably. Your health, quite possibly. The state of crops, the prospect for harvest. There's no comparison in being unable to have children or no TV, but it does show how our focus works. For both Elizabeth and Zechariah, this would have been so difficult because that would have been their total focus, I'm sure. And behind these obvious concerns, there are deeper questions for the culture of that time, but also for a culture of today. Something is wrong in the world. People are suffering. Your people are suffering. Wicked foreigners have come from far away with hatred in their eyes and weapons in their hands. Darkness and death have stalked the land. Many people in many countries have had all this to think about for many, many centuries. And behind that, again, there may be a sense that though much has gone wrong somehow, there's got to be that hope. There's got to be hope to put things right. We look at this, prepare the way of the Lord. Hope. Things will be put right. But let go of this and you're sunk. Often it's the older generation are the ones that cherish memories and imaginations, who keep alive the rumours of hope. And what I mean by that is a lot of younger people, and this goes for me as well, is with that bogged down. I mean, this week, it's like us all wearing masks here. We've probably all judged what's gone on in news this week. And it becomes our centre and it becomes our focus. And because we've grown up with it, that's how we think. That becomes culture. Our older generation is slightly different because they remember a time when there were no televisions, when media wasn't as easy to grab hold of. You didn't have a smartphone in your hand and you were looking at it every 5 or 10 minutes. The focus were different. The focus became community and themselves. I'm not convinced we live in a better time, if I'm honest. I think social media, smartphones, etc., I think they're taking us back to dark ages. That's my view. Zechariah comes across in this passage, especially in this prophetic poem, as someone who has pondered the agony and the hope for many years, and who now finds that agony coming out of him as he looks in awe and delight at this baby, his baby son. The Benedictus, it's a poem about God acting at last, finally doing what he promised many centuries ago, and doing it at a time when people had their fill of hatred and oppression. This was a time in Israel's history where there'd been no prophecy for a long time. It was a time where God appeared to be silent. Israel had been waiting for over 400 years for God to speak to them. And all this time they were watching the Romans come and take possession of their land. You know, Isaiah prophesied the Christ coming. We heard the wonderful counselor, Isaiah 9. And it were 800 years before Christ. 800 years before Christ, they told Christ were coming. 400 years before any prophecy. Israel had been waiting hundreds of years for God to answer the questions. It's even recorded in the book of Malachi, chapter 2, verse 17, the cry of Israel, where is the God of justice? One even empire after another trampled them underfoot. And now at last God was going to give them their deliverance. We can feel the long years of pain and sorrow, of darkness and death, overshadowing Zechariah's mind. Nameless enemies are lurking around the corner in his imagination and his experience. And no doubt it was partly this that made him question Gabriel's words in the first place. But we can also feel the long years of quiet prayer and trust in Zechariah. God had made a covenant with Abraham. This is a Benedictus. This is what I was talking about when I started, about the prayers that I do every morning, the Benedictus. God had made a covenant with Abraham. God had promised to send a new David. God had spoken of a prophet who would go ahead to prepare the way. All those things had known, believed, prayed and longed for. And now is the time. Now is the time this is all going to come true. Much of the poem could be read simply as a celebration of what we could call political salvation, though a few ancient Jews and not very many modern ones would want to separate the secular from the sacred, the way the modern West has done. But there are signs that Zechariah's vision goes beyond simply a realigning of political power, God's mercy, the forgiveness of sins, the rescue from death itself. All this points to a deeper and wider meaning of salvation. You know, in his gospel, Luke is preparing us to see God in fulfilling the great promise of the Old Testament. It's going beyond worldly salvation, and it's opening a door to an all new world where sin and death themselves will be dealt with. And the course of this message it occupies all the rest of Luke's gospel. Zechariah's own story of 9 months' silence suddenly is broken at the naming of this child. It's a reflection on a smaller scale of what was going on in Israel of that day. Prophecy, many believed, like I've already said, God had been silent for a long time. But now it was going to burst out again. Many back to true allegiance with God. And what had begun as a kind of punishment for Zechariah's lack of faith now turns into a new sort of sign, a sign that God is doing new things. Luke's long first chapter holds what we often find easier to keep separate. At point after point, he has linked this story of the ancient biblical records of Israel to the patriarchs, the kings, prophets, and the Psalms. Luke's writing of the moment when the century-old story was going to come around the corner at last. It was going to come out of darkness and into this sudden light. When we were talking, we had a communications meeting, didn't we, months ago? And we said, what's this focus going to be on Christmas? And Jacqueline said, we need something to turn to light. It's been an hard 20 months for all of us. We need to turn to light. And I praise God for that. And every time I'm writing my sermons now, I just think about, and it sounds simple, doesn't it? We need something to turn to the light. But we do. We live in such a dark time, such an hard time, such an hard 20 months. And let's be honest, we don't know what the next 12 months is going to bring. You know, we only have to look at us all today, sat back wearing masks, having to go over there and eat. How do you drink a cup of tea with that mask on? What's going on in the world? Where are we going to be in 12 months' time? But we've got to be safe. I've lost my place. But as Luke, out of darkness into sudden light, he never forgets this larger perspective. Everything that he will tell us about Jesus makes sense as a fulfillment of God's ancient promise. Jesus, the hope of Israel, has come to fruition at last. It starts with his son John. Prepare the way of the Lord. Luke's story shakes equally with the personal hopes and fears of ordinary people like you and me. Zechariah, Elizabeth and Mary stand out as real people, hesitating between faith and doubt. How often do we do that? We hesitate between faith and doubt. Called to trust God at a new moment in history. It's a mark not only of Luke's skill as a writer, but also of the nature of the God that he's writing about. That both the big picture and the smaller human stories really matter. Humanity really matters. Even the smallest. You know, I give praise in church to those people that we don't even know do things. Have you ever noticed in church things just happen? It's like little elves come along during the night and do these things, and you know, and I mean, all these people, they don't look for thanks. We don't even see them doing it, and things happen. I give thanks and praise for everything else as well. It's important, but they're humble that just silently just get on with it. Hallelujah. Everybody matters. Smaller human stories matter. And this is, after all, as Zechariah glimpsed the story of how the Creator God came to rescue his people. It's the story, as Luke now tells, of how God himself was born of a baby, Emmanuel. Last week, if you remember, I challenged you all, even you men, to be Elizabeths. Any of you successful at being an Elizabeth? Come on, guys, get in touch with your feminine bit. This week, I want you all to be Zacharias. I want you all to be Zacharias this week. As you approach this coming few weeks and this season of celebrating Christ's birth, how do you come? How do you come as you prepare for this season? Do you come like Zechariah did to the temple that one day, going through the motions of celebration and worship, but with no real sense of trust or expectation that what God promised through the gift of his Son has any impact on you or has any real power? Do you come with the pain of unmet desire? Do you come with longing for Christ's presence to be made real again in you? When we had prayers of the week, we kept talking about, it kept cropping up all the time, about Jesus being the very centre. Somebody even sent us a picture about Jesus at the very centre of everything we do. Is that your desire, that Jesus is there in the centre of everything you do? So it should be. Or do you come with the longing for Christ's presence to be made real in you again, for that Spirit just to liven you up? Do you come from a place of darkness or despair or grief? I think we can all relate to that at times. Maybe you come like Zechariah after the birth of his son John, filled with the Spirit and overflowing with praise at how God has revealed himself to you. No matter how you come to this season, know that the God himself will come and meet you. God will come and meet you individually. You've got to open yourselves up to him. He'll come to find you, whether you expect it or not, desired or not, planned for or not. Christ will come. Christ has come. It comes like the sun rising to those living in the darkness to guide their feet into the paths of peace. Let's pray. God of love, you brought forth light as your first act of creation. You brought forth light and darkness did not overcome. And you brought forth light in the form of your Son, Jesus Christ, who continues to shine the light of hope in a world of darkness and despair. Father, you've called us to shine with your light. You've called us to bring your light to the world. And as we prepare this Advent for Christmas, help us to shine your light more brightly and brighten our lives. Call us into the way of your Son's love, peace, mercy, and justice, that we might share the light of hope in this world in this coming season. Lord God, just be with every one of us. I pray for Christchurch this morning. I pray a blessing upon Christchurch. I pray a blessing upon this community. And Lord, for those who are in the darkness of this earth, I just pray that your light will shine upon them and through them. And I pray that you do it through us. Many times I've said we can't all be leaders, but we can all be ministers. Allow us to minister to people and to bring the light into their lives in whatever way you show us. So Lord Jesus, as we prepare the way for you, we pray that this season you will stand at the very centre of our church, the very centre of our hearts, and continue to shine within us and for those around us. And we pray this in your name. Amen. Amen.